I've known Josh for over a decade now, and I'm really happy to have him here at SVA. Josh and I started in the same DIY artist-run space scene in Austin, and I think communal experiences like that tend to inform an artist's practice, and this is certainly true for Josh. As his practice since those days of late gallery rent payment have expanded to include teaching, archiving, performance, sound, writing, and community building. Currently, Josh is a faculty member at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where he teaches courses in visual critical studies and research-based practice.
Can't hear you much.
His various cultural practices engage intercultural contact and archival interdeterminacy in order to generate reparative counter-images and social transformation. Recent projects have been featured in the Bemis Center for Contemporary Arts in Omaha, the Blue Star Contemporary in San Antonio, Tufts University Art Galleries in Boston, and upcoming projects include an exhibition at DiverseWorks in Houston and at the Truth and Reconciliation Residency at the Santa Fe Art Institute. Please help me in welcoming Josh Rios.
Thanks, Carlos. Thanks, Allison. Thanks, everybody here for inviting me and letting me sort of elaborate on some, I don't know, I can't call them projects or works, or I'm not sure what to call this kind of activity exactly. But I'll sort of start off just by reading something just to make sure I kind of, I guess, frame things in a certain way. So I know for me anyways, the identity of the artist it's kind of been a struggle to sort of engage for a long time, but I wouldn't begrudge anybody who can easily engage that identity. I understand that it's a sort of place of privilege, and it's also kind of like it's a sort of tough thing to sort of define yourself in that way and to do all the activities that will then verify that kind of decision. But anyways, regardless of that, I kind of come from a tradition or a sort of history of institutional critique. And so my background and inclination is to sort of place notions of the artist within a cultural network that includes many interrelated yet separate spaces and economies and practices, including like the museum, the gallery, art criticism, art history, collections, collectors, curation, curators, as well as art markets. Social and economic relations, of course, not only produce museums and galleries and markets, but artists as well, with class, race, and gender, and other sort of markers of identification, playing a crucial role in the process. So who can sustain the risks of engaging in art on a professional level, and what context do they emerge from? These are like essential questions for thinking through the commodification of creativity. So galleries, museums, markets, residencies, etc. are disproportionately populated by the economically privileged, who in turn impose their sort of value systems onto fields of creativity. So in response, hopefully my practice is purposefully dispersed and open to a variety of impulses associated with, exhibition making, like in a classic kind of sense, performance, sound and music making, cultural programming, curation, writing, criticism, and art history. So, however, only as these sort of disciplines are filtered through and transformed by creative, critical practice meant to sort of challenge pre-given forms of thinking, through this kind of cultural symbolic production. And yes, I guess I would describe my practice as a kind of research-based or inquiry-based network of concerns, where there are these moments when this sort of research or inquiry is directed towards some kind of public in some kind of way, which involves a sort of like engagement with aesthetic production, or kind of like formal thickening, maybe, as a way to deal with it. So, and a big part of my own interests are rooted in critical theory, critical race studies, historiography, and notions of temporality and futurity. Writing is also, like, of course, another way of investigating a kind of line of inquiry, but also a way to conduct more research for other possible outcomes, in different disciplinary fields. So some of the things that I'm kind of like very sort of engaged with are these kinds of terms like paradigm, which of course is just like a sort of system of beliefs, and ontology, of course, which is like nature of reality or how we view reality. Epistemology, which is like how, knowledge, like how we know something about this reality, and methodology, the way we go about producing knowledge about this reality that we then use to sort of like shape and guide beliefs. So those are the kind of overarching kind of frameworks or whatever that I'm trying to like kind of deal with in a lot of ways. And I have like a ton of things to like look at and read through and so on and so forth. Most of these slides are just kind of go back like to around 2015 or so maybe, or I guess that's like 3 years of, and of course this is by no means like everything, it's just like a few things related to like some particular moments where exhibition or publication or performance, took place. So research is a big kind of sort of interest for me, and one of the things that I'm constantly looking at is like kind of archival publications or archival sort of documents that sort of elaborate on a particular time or movement. And one of the movements and times I'm kind of increasingly more and more compelled by is this sort of late 60s throughout the 70s and maybe even early 80s kind of production of a particular kind of political subject, the Mexican American, or also the politicized version of that, the Chicano or Chicana or Chicanx, which is just another way of describing a kind of political subjectivity that kind of has to do with like indigenous identity, Mexican identity, and also U.S. identity, all kind of interrelated and interlaced. So these are just some images from some different publications that have kind of been produced by different culture producers. And so I guess for me, there's a kind of interest in like visual culture in general. So I'm kind of like trying to engage like digital humanities and also digital archives and also archives in general, like kind of constantly throughout my work. And it's in a way to like, I would almost say produce a counter history maybe in a way, or to sort of engage history in a particular way. So these are just some kinds of like sculptures that were produced thinking about like research and like printing out tons of PDFs, downloading tons of things, scanning tons of things, trying to like use collage in a kind of like monumental way and trying to think through collage as a way of actually engaging research, cutting things up like manually, physically, but also reading through them simultaneously and trying to like arrange them in some kind of way that's like kind of like a message board or a mood board of like research, kind of a lot of it related to this sort of themes that I mentioned earlier. And this was at a space called Art in These Times. And In These Times is a magazine in Chicago. It's like a kind of labor rights sort of socialist magazine that has like a long history of engaging politics and social struggle in Chicago. And they also had like a space where they have like allow artists to produce some kind of cultural exhibition of some kind. It's not always like this. Sometimes it's like different types of things. Sometimes it's like more like contemporary art. Sometimes it's more like workshops and whatnot. So it has like a lot of variety. The exhibition was called Richard Serra is an Important Latino Artist. And I was reading this, there's a lot here, but I'll just kind of go briefly. I was reading this kind of listicle, that was like, 35 important Latino artists. And then it had Richard Serra in there because his father was from Spain. And I just thought that was like an interesting kind of stretch or convolution of this sort of identity and how it's used at certain times to produce certain kinds of effects. And so the press release was this bio that, and I'll say this, I collaborate a lot, mostly collaborate with people. In this case with Anthony Romero, who I've been collaborating with for since 2012 or so. So Richard Serra received his MFA from Yale University in 1964, after which he spent a year in Paris and Florence, funded by a Yale traveling fellowship and a Fulbright grant. His early work, drawn from the experience of working in steel mills and shipyards, focused on industrial materials. In an iconic early work, Serra threw molten refried beans against the walls of his studio. Though casts were eventually created from the impact of the beans, the emphasis of the piece was on its process. And then this kind of is sort of circulated back into the internet world. And so if you type in Richard Serra as an important Latino artist, there'll be images from this exhibition and images of Richard Serra's sculptures kind of appearing simultaneously on the screen in the image thing. So I don't know, I find that kind of compelling and interesting. So part of this exhibition too included the production of an essay that dealt with a particular photographer, and the essay, I don't know if I guess I didn't pull it up after all. Well, anyways, it's a part of the exhibition included the production of an essay. So I just thought that just to kind of keep that in mind. And the essay was about this photographer, Luis Carlos Bernal, who's like a sort of Chicano Mexican-American photographer who took a lot of pictures in the 1970s, documenting the interior or homes of Mexican-Americans along the U.S.-Mexico border. But he also took pictures of the Olympics in 1989, I think, when it was in LA. And so this essay was part of the thing, and you could come and you could take the essay. And then it was published online in on this website called Dilettante Army, where you'll see, here's my beautiful visage. There's a bunch of different, there's no internet, that's okay. There's a bunch of different essays here that I've written over the last few years. In this case, this one is a banana consciousness, and this essay is part of a chapter for an upcoming exhibition that looks back into the 1980s at artists' call against intervention and Central America. So if you're familiar with kind of the politics of the hemisphere, the U.S. has been meddling in Latin America and Central America for ever, and partially to kind of deflect the possibility of communism having a foothold in, on the hemisphere, partially to kind of extract resources, sort of supplanting social democracy and supporting right-wing military dictatorships. Yeah. So this essay is kind of about this series of exhibitions that actually took place in New York and also Chicago and maybe one other location of artists who were engaged in making a call against U.S. intervention into Central and Latin America. And so this is kind of upcoming, so that's what this thing is. Kind of emerging from that, I became me and collaborators and other people too are involved in this process. Became interested in sort of science fiction and thinking about the future and the possibility of imagining different kinds of futures and who's in those futures and what are they doing and are they, what kinds of roles are they engaged in, or do they even exist at all? And so kind of looking at this kind of history of science fiction as more than just imaginary or illusory, but as a kind of world building process or a symbolic form of world building. So became interested in this kind of idea of Chicano futurism or Latin American science fiction and futurism, which is akin to this other sort of cultural form that called Afrofuturism. Maybe it sounds somewhat familiar. It's a history of cultural production that tries to look at the role of technology and marginalization, oppression, and colonialism and things like that in relationship to science fiction and the kind of imaginary and the social imaginary. So I started working with this author who's like a cyberpunk, Mexican-American cyberpunk author who produced like 3 or 4 novels in the late 80s, early 90s, like in the tradition of like William Gibson's Neuromancer and like Marge Piercy's Women on the Edge of Time, or other sort of kind of like politically motivated science fiction authors who are trying to like imagine different kinds of like eco-utopias or sort of feminist utopias, but through like an engagement with technology and science. And so for me, this like kind of falls in that tradition. And so I started working with this person, Ernest Hogan, and he has the last name Hogan because he's partially Irish, but he identifies as like Chicano or Mexican-American. And this novel, High Aztec, kind of became super important to me. The novel it's set like in the 100 years on the anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. And it's a future world where the U.S. has kind of collapsed and Mexico has risen up to like a global first world nation. And it's kind of full of ironies because nothing is any better, of course. It's just like a first world global, capitalist post-industrial nation. So they have like all the same kinds of issues and problems that any other place would have that occupies that position, So there's like massive like garbage dumps. There's totally disenfranchised groups of people. Social, like popular media is used as a method of control. There's like tons of militarization of society is ever present. So this is kind of like an interesting kind of entry point to a lot of things for me. I've started really engaging his website, Ernest Hogan's website called Mondo Ernesto, where he has like all this. It's kind of like semi-ranting, but not really. But then also there's like tons of YouTube links that, if you start to read them like a text, they start to produce these kind of interesting meanings where like Trump is kind of connected to like space exploration, and then like Day of the Dead celebrations. I don't know, there's this kind of really interesting intertextual kind of, it's almost like cybernetic kind of way of meaning making that he's producing on this blog. So that's kind of like became really interesting to me. So we were in this exhibition and we had a chance to produce a newspaper. And so the newspaper featured both like a kind of analysis by me of some of his writings and images, and also we I guess commandeered him to produce a text of his own to be printed in the newspaper alongside with our like writing. And so this on the top is his text called a Kalika in a spacesuit. And a Kalika is like the sort of like Day of the Dead skull. So you imagine a skull, like no flesh, in a helmet of spaceman's helmet, space person's helmet, like floating in space. It's kind of a really fascinating image. But of course the Kalika is like a kind of Mexican tradition too of like Day of the Dead stuff. So, and then the subtitle is Confessions of a Sci-Fi Chicano Artist. And here's Ernest holding the newspaper up. So these are some of his collages and sort of like images that he's kind of produced. And I've actually been able to borrow some things from him to show at different exhibitions, and I'll kind of present those in a second when we get there. But I'm kind of really fascinated by this idea of high-tech voodoo tunes, and also like galactic aboriginalness. Of course, like it's just like a fascinating kind of concept. And then the surrealist kind of collage mechanism that's used to sort of elaborate on this idea of like kind of a Frankensteinian monster. So we did a kind of interesting little residency at a college called Harold Washington College in Chicago, and we were able to sort of interject some objects and images into these cases that were these massive display cases that are on the sort of floor where the arts stuff is. And we were also able to borrow some more of Ernest's drawings and get them framed and hang them up on the administrative floor of the college, the 8th floor. And he also produced some text in relationship to the images. And part of that thing which again, like I said, I'm not sure what these are. They're not exactly projects, but part of this activity included working with students to produce I guess what I call like the back blurb of a potential futuristic novel. And so each student produced one, and then we printed them like kind of in this photoshopped way and printed them out and displayed them in the cases along with other artifacts, which I'll show in a second. But here's one actually that was produced by the instructor of the class. I just liked it. The year is 2019. A cyborg with a familiar appearance comes to Chicago through a secret portal underneath Cloudgate. And if you're not familiar with Cloudgate, it's like this giant Anish Kapoor sculpture that it's like a tourist attraction in the Loop in the financial district. It looks like a giant bean. Okay, so some portal opens up through that Cloudgate. And upon making it to City Hall, the mysterious figure makes known that he is Harold Washington, whose body was preserved and enhanced by an alien race from an alternative universe. And of course, you may not know this, but Harold Washington is like a kind of beloved city mayor, first African-American mayor of Chicago. He kind of preceded all came after the dailies. And I don't know, he did he was like a really coalition builder and sort of really beloved. Okay, and there's more of it, but I'll just keep moving. So here's some of the things that were on display in the cases. So part of my practice has been amassing a kind of archive of Ernest's publications. So you can see some of those artifacts in this case. All right. So continuing to think through that, but other things as well. This image or set of images, it points to a two-part project that was done in Chicago at the Gallery of Carolina Picard, who I think was here last week or Thursday. Yeah, so maybe you remember that or heard something from her. The gallery that Carolina runs. So this two-part thing had to do with a exhibition and a performance. And in the performance, there's two things happening kind of simultaneously, but also in one after another. One is I'm reading a kind of rewritten version of Waiting for Godot called Waiting for, what did I call it? I think I have it. Hold on. Oh, yeah. Oh, maybe I just called it Waiting for Godot up to a point. Yeah. And so in the play that I've rewritten, it's two characters who are in a waiting room as opposed to underneath a tree at some crossroads. They're in a waiting room that is sort of related to a sort of health clinic or a detention center or something along those lines, trying to think about where do people wait when they have to wait a long time to get some service of some kind, social service of some sort. So it's a rewriting of that sort of, but thinking through the potential of this waiting room being a bunch of different sites, including some futuristic detention site. And then at the same time, or simultaneously, but also one after another, Anthony's doing a kind of performative reading of Robert Smithson's lecture that's about his visits to the Yucatan. And he's sort of reading this lecture, which is kind of hard to read because it has all these kind of colonial fantasies in it, interwoven it throughout it, which I'll share with you in just a second. Not to make him look like a bad person, but just to show you some of the kind of things that I think that are kind of interesting to us. And Robert Smithson's lecture, he's sort of talking about this ruined hotel, Palenque Hotel. And he kind of has these different pictures he's taken, and he's sort of describing it and pointing to the pictures and showing the pictures and giving the lecture. So in this kind of iteration, Anthony's reading the lecture, and the images though are sort of different. The images show that we've picked and sort of substituted for Smithson's images are archival images of this population in San Diego, this Mexican American population in San Diego, taking over the space underneath the two freeways crossing. So the space underneath the freeway, which was sort of given to this community in word, that they could have this space underneath these two freeways to build a park. But as things unfolded, it turned out that the city actually needed a highway patrol substation there instead. So they took their word back. It was never like on paper or anything. It was just like an agreement. So they took their word back and said, no, we're actually going to start building this substation. And the whole community, along with like students who would come back from radicalized from college in California, Mexican students came back and with their families and with the community sort of like occupied this space and started to improve it in ways like plant things, dig it up. And here's, you can see a picture of a youth kind of pickaxing some concrete and like trying to like make it into something. So I think we're just interested in the idea of a site and a non-site and who gets to count a site as being a site and who's not, doesn't get counted and who becomes a non kind of engaging thing with a site. So those kind of things are all working in our sort of heads, like thinking about this history of this sort of occupation of this space in San Diego underneath these two freeways in relationship to Robert Smithson's kind of like, I don't know, I won't call it gallivanting, but kind of like touring the Yucatan in a way. So this is kind of like a particularly kind of compelling section of Robert Smithson's lecture. Now this is the restaurant where I spent many happy hours discussing the rise and fall of the ancient Mayan gods with Virginia Dawn and Nancy Holt. We discussed many things. Actually, the old Mexican gods were rather cruel. As a matter of fact, they had quite an interesting corn or agricultural process. When they would plant corn and seed, they would sacrifice a baby and cut him all up and then plant him along with the corn seed in the ground. And then when the corn grew a little higher, they would take a young boy and slice him all up and plant him along with the adolescent corn sprouts. And then when it was fully grown and ready to take off, they would do the same thing with an old man. So that sort of gives you the feeling that lurks in Mexico. There is something about Mexico, an overall hidden, concealed violence about the landscape itself. Many artists and writers have gone to Mexico and been completely destroyed, you know? It happened to Hart Crane after he left Mexico. He jumped off the back of a boat into the propellers and was completely cut to ribbons. So you have to be very careful when you go to Mexico so that you are not caught up in this, in any of this kind of unconscious, dangerous violence that is really lurking in every patch of earth. It's just there, everywhere, trying to get you so that you have to be on guard at all times. While we were talking there, we were waiting for our guide who was going to take us down into the jungle areas around Guatemala. And then so here's some more images of the park as it was completed, like, you know, in the sort of late 70s. And this underpass sort of form influenced some graphic choices I've made in the past and so forth. And this is the work of Roberto Torres, who is extremely interesting to me for a lot of reasons. He was one of the main kind of visual architects of what the park should look like. Of course, this is like a purely like fantastical, imaginary sort of image that was never built at all. But so if you look, you can kind of see where the three prongs kind of come out past the bridge here. So that's where the park actually is, just in that little space, okay? So the park is only there, but his imagination far exceeds that. And I will kind of blow this one up so maybe we can see a little bit better because it's kind of important to me. There's a legend all along the outside, and the legend it tells you about a sort of building, and then it gives you like a little symbol. So you can see there's one that says free hospital, and it has like 3 dots surrounded by 3 circles with 3 or some like outline things kind of jutting out. So if we look on the map, that's not it. Oh, it's up there on the top corner. You can see the symbol up there. So that would be like a free hospital. There's also a International Chicano Free Port, which I think is probably important, and a Universidad del Barrio. So this kind of like idea of the future, imagining some potential or some new sort of sites in conjunction with this kind of Robert Smithson texts, thinking of non-sites and new kinds of sites. That's kind of what that piece was about for the most part. Oh, I guess I'll keep going back here. So there was also a kind of installational moment, and without getting into too much detail about the titling, the title is taken from a film by Efron Gutierrez. And so this space had a doorway in it. So the first thing we did was put in this chicken wire door, or like a kind of chicken coop kind of door, to sort of start engage the space in a new way, so that the first thing you had to do was kind of like almost like enter this, I guess it's like a conceptual chicken coop or something like that. I don't know what that means exactly, but growing up in a certain kind of way, one side of my family had tons of like chickens and pigs and things like that, and that's kind of always been kind of important to me, cows and whatnot. And inside of there's like various framed works and a couple of like small moments of installation, and there's like this hat that has a pace picante hat. I don't know if you're familiar with pace picante, but it's a kind of like picante sauce, or like salsa, that gets a lot of flack for being made in New York City. Or not being made in New York City. That's the gimmick of the thing. It's like some guy's eating picante, or a kind of salsa, and it's not pace, it's some other brand, and they find out it's made in New York City, and it's like terrible, so they have to go get the real one, pace picante, from San Antonio. So anyways, there's this hat there, and underneath there's like a little speaker, and it's like hooked up to a Bluetooth, and it's playing a particular kind of song that is evocative of something in specific, which is not that important right now. So here's an opportunity for us to like kind of represent some Ernest Hogan's drawings, so frame them up and kind of give him a small solo exhibition within our even smaller exhibition. So this idea of trying to like constantly sort of share resources in a way, and of course there's a bungee cord hanging from the screen door, which is the optimal way to close a screen door. Some close-ups. So this serpent-headed spaceship becomes important later. It becomes like the title of a whole series of different kinds of activities, sonic activities, lectures, animations, and so forth. So trying to imagine like being in a serpent-headed spaceship and sort of making a broadcast to Earth in a way. It's like an important symbol that I both found here but also reinvent. And this is just kind of like an interior shot. And this is kind of like this kind of like exhibition making style, I guess. And some of the images and things in here are reappropriated from the performance. You'll see that the text is being read from this kind of like mop microphone stand, and it's kind of like abject, kind of, I don't know, something to like block the face. And it has a little photograph sort of attached to it. So a lot of things get recycled, I guess. I won't say upcycled because they usually deteriorate as they keep getting remanipulated, but the idea of like not really making a single kind of thing, but always being in a process and engaging things through the idea of process as opposed to like coming to a point. So that's sort of stopped. So that's why I call it like a kind of thickening, I guess, because right here this sculptural thing comes back together as something. Then it goes away and becomes something else. So if we look back at this pedestal too, this kind of performance happens again in New York, actually, like maybe about 4 years ago or so. And the Robert Smithson comes back up again too. So the images that are like big prints are stills taken from this magazine called La Raza. And the stills directly are documenting the Chicano moratorium, which was like the largest anti-Vietnam War protest in the country at the time, which I think it was like 1971 or 1970, if I think I got that date right. And so these images show like kind of police turning what was kind of like protest, or I would say peaceful protest, into a kind of crisis situation by applying militarized pressure to a group of people, and resulting in the death of kind of like an important journalist, Ruben Salazar, and that will come back up later. And the text over the images are these like sort of excerpts from the Smithson quote, to continue to sort of rethink how he's imagining place and how I'm trying to imagine place, and to sort of like see what happens when things that don't line up are placed in relationship to each other, and just see if any kind of different kinds of meanings can be produced. And so you can see that then this sort of pedestal is both sculptural in the sense that it's sort of leaned up and then it's reactivated and reassembled. So another kind of thing becomes extremely interesting to both me and Anthony, and that's this play. This play that's called Strangers in a Strange Land, that was directed or produced or sort of produced under the guidance of this high school English teacher named Greg Barrios. And so this is 1976, and Greg Barrios, working with his high school class, produces this science fiction space rock opera based on the music of David Bowie. It's also based on a bunch of other different things, like a U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. It's based on the novel Animal Farm. It's based on the students' own experiences with Border Patrol. It's based on what else? The Man Who Fell to Earth, this David Bowie film that came out, Nicholas Roeg film. And this is the high school is in this county or this area where the little dot is, so you can just kind of get a sense of where it is. And I got in contact with Greg Barrios through a weird network of sort of engagements. And we started kind of communicating, and he started to send me some images that he would dig through and find that are like a documentation of this play. So you can see some images here of the students kind of dressed up as mimes, singing like different David Bowie songs, and acting out these different kinds of scenarios. The trouble is, it's like a high school play in the 70s in Texas, small town Texas. The population of Crystal City is like 10,000, so it wasn't like a ton of stuff was done around this play, but to me it really triggered something like thought-provoking to think about David Bowie, the Border Patrol, the sort of like space odyssey, and so forth. And of course, alienation and the production of the alien and the stranger in particular. Crystal City was also and this is partly influences the play, was one of the site of one of the family internment camps of World War II. So of course there was like some really famous one in California, but there was also one here in this small, which was actually, I think, supposed to be bigger in a way. And of course it was like a place where, like Japanese, Italian, and German descent Americans were shipped off to and held, against their will. So here's some during World War II. This is like the Commission on Civil Rights report. So you can kind of see, it's called Stranger in One's Land. The play is called Stranger in a Strange Land. There's a book by Robert Heinlein called Stranger in a Strange Land. And it has like different chapters like the poor and the law and so forth. And it really describes the kind of conditions that Mexican Americans were living through along the U.S.-Mexico border in the late 60s and early 70s, which were, kind of like kind of hard. So the libretto, I don't know if you have any theater people out here, but the libretto of a play outlines the kind of action and the songs. And so this was the kind of high school libretto that they produced. And at the bottom, you can kind of see what the action would be. And if you kind of read it, you can kind of see what would happen. And I'll kind of get into that a little bit. And the libretto featured the lyrics, the action, which is like kind of down here. And then it also had like different images embedded into it. And to Panic in Detroit, this is kind of what it would have looked like at the time, printed on a yellow with the kind of black ink. And then this is, so Barrios dug around, and we're like in conversation this whole time. He dug around and found 8 rolls of 8mm film, like filming a kind of rehearsal. And so he shipped those to me, and we digitally kind of transferred them. And then all this kind of comes together in a way at this exhibition at the Bemis, where there's like a kind of essay, and there's the video documentation, there's some images, new images by Ernest Hogan, and there's a bunch of artifacts in this display case that are kind of dealing with some of these notions of like sci-fi futurity and like kind of power. And the work is called "Is Our Thing a Future of the Past?" And it's already it has like multiple iterations. It never looks the same, and it's kind of like a kind of archive, a sort of like fictive archive, showing different things, including this 45 that David Bowie released called "Crystal Japan," which sort of is discussed by Greg and others as kind of being a funny coincidence, given that the city where this play was produced is called Crystal City. That's the sort of way it looked in San Antonio. And so these are some of the kinds of like things we're thinking about, like what is our collective history and our current historical moment? What in our collective history and current historical moment has caused this strange, troubling, and uncannily familiar future to take shape? Readers of borderland science fiction confront not only near and distant futures, but also how the histories of U.S.-Mexico colonial and neocolonial relations of power have provided and continue to provide the material conditions for this future. So just this text is actually in the floor there, and it's a quote by a cultural sort of like literary critic, Lisa Rivera. This performance is the broadcast from a serpent-headed spaceship in which different texts are excerpted and read kind of like in a citational mode and presented alongside with experimental music and also kind of different animations that are dealing with this giant archive of glass lantern slides at the Stony Island Art Bank. And a glass lantern slide is like the old school way that art historians would show images and then talk about them. And they had a collection that was pretty long. It was like a bunch of like old wooden cases that would like almost, I guess from like this corner to that pillar back there, about this high, and with these little drawers that would come out. And in each of those drawers was like a whole row of glass lantern slides, and that the art history professor would like put up and show. So, like 90% of the slides were like, Greek and Roman architecture. 10% of the slides were like Impressionism and modernity. And then like small, like one row of slides was like Latin America. And then like at the very bottom, there was one little like sleeve that was like Mexico. So I just found that kind of like very interesting and telling, like how this sort of spatially worked out. And so using those like slides that were the minor amount of slides that were used, that were kind of photographs from like Mexico archaeological sites and so forth, produced like a series of animations, which you can kind of see one of them in the background. This is just an image of just to show you like there's like a writing practice, and this essay is produced for this Transtemporalities show, or Transtemporalities journal, and this whole kind of essay deals with a bunch of different things, including like a Doctor Who episode where, do y'all watch Doctor Who? You know what that is? Okay, well anyways, Doctor Who episode where they are in the TARDIS, which is the spaceship, and it's broken, right? So it takes them, they never know where they're going. It's always just like a random. So sometimes it's into outer space to meet some aliens, and sometimes it stays on the planet and they meet aliens. So in this episode, they get transported to like pre-Columbian, like Tenochtitlan, so like before whatever Columbus, and they get transported into the center of this like pyramid, what do they do when they find out they're in this pyramid? They actually start immediately just rifling through everything and just like trying on the jewelry and like kind of just like wandering around, kind of messing it all up. And one of the characters, Barbara, puts on this particular bracelet, and they find their way out of the pyramid. And when they go out, they're confronted by this priest. And the priest sees this woman who's like British from the whatever 40s and wearing this bracelet, and he thinks she's like a reincarnated goddess or god, Yetaxa, which is a fictional thing. It doesn't exist. They just made it up for the storyline. And so now all of a sudden this character, Barbara, who's like this kind of British explorer in a broken ship, is like a goddess, and she tries to go about changing Aztec culture by sort of like convincing them that they shouldn't do human sacrifices. And so it just kind of unfolds from there and goes along and along. It's like really kind of interesting to me. And so this essay tries to talk about that and talk about colonialism, temporality, space, and spatialness, exploration, and kind of critique of Enlightenment, sort of forms of knowledge production around exploration and time traveling. Because, like in certain kinds of ways, Enlightenment era explorers really thought, like, as they kind of moved away from the center spatially, like around the globe, they were actually going back in time in a way, like seeing the step-by-step progressions of civilization. So if they could go back and see an Aboriginal, that they could see themselves in some way at the start of some process that they had arrived at. So a lot of ways, this kind of idea of time travel is not just, it has nothing actually that much to do with like technology in the strict sense, but more like the technology of knowledge production and sort of thinking about otherness. This set of images just sort of like shows a moment where some of this material is produced in a kind of public-facing way in this case, for a film that was made in the basement of a bank that had been underwater for like X amount of years and was given to Theaster Gates for $1 by Rahm Emanuel to turn into like a cultural center called Stony Island Arts Bank. So anyways, it's kind of weird. Another iteration of it happened in Omaha at the Bemis Center for Contemporary Arts. And in this case, there's like some kind of interactions with food and sound. So these beans are sorted and it kind of produce a certain kind of tone as they go into a metal tin. There's the more readings of different kinds of texts and more performative actions, including this kind of like, I would call like an avant-garde cooking experimental sound sort of thing of dropping hard dried beans onto a snare drum to produce a kind of track, a kind of audio track. So now I'm trying to like work through some ideas of like, okay, if this play existed, they probably needed music to go along with it. And so I'm kind of constructing this sort of fictive narrative of a band that was playing like experimental kind of avant-garde sort of space sort of type of music in relationship to the students' play. And sort of like making these kinds of collages that are more like just ways of thinking. So at the bottom is the kind of action of the play, and the top is this series of found photographs that show a bunch of different musicians sort of playing at a kind of, I guess I'll call it like a, what do you call it? It's like some kind of event where they're trying to get donations. You can see it in some of the images. So, Lady Stardust is a young folk singer of great beauty. She sings songs of the, it's hard to read. She sings songs of the forthcoming doom. But it calms people instead of making them fearful. War and Peace, who's a character in the play, realizes what a valuable talent Lady Stardust will be in the forthcoming national elections. He decides to use her for his own ends. So that's kind of the action of the play. It's sort of stuff like that. The Starman, and if you know Bowie, you know Starman is like a major character. The Starman begins to jam the electronics systems with strange messages to the youth of the world. A local lad calls his girl and tells her of the message from space. They begin to follow the Starman in large numbers. Is he a savior? So just kind of trying to construct this, I guess, this kind of band that would have been going along with the play. And then these are like costume designs for some of the students' costumes that of course don't exist. They're just like collages I've made. But for me, they're like fictional archival costume designs of the potential outfits that the students would have worn in this kind of like space rock opera from the 70s. And the collage materials come from a specific place. They come from on the right, this comic book that came out in the 80s called the Aztec Ace, which is like a kind of comic book about a time-traveling Aztec detective who has to go back and fix all these like time problems that happen. It's kind of really out of control and kind of like sexist and weird. But I just find it kind of compelling that the language that's used to see language about like Mayan culture and time traveling together is kind of interesting to me. And then on the other side are these two books that are like kind of become collage materials too, which are the 500 years of Chicano and Chicana history and pictures. And so I'm kind of working on this comic book at the same time that shows kinds of like, I guess like counterpoints about time and also like protest and thinking about temporality and this sort of history of politicization. So one last chance before the time storm builds to a critical peak of collision eras, whatever that is, back in sync at last. And it's sort of like stuff like this along the lines of this. Rebuilding a world of false tomorrow. It's kind of makes sense to me as a kind of like caption, I guess. Maybe I'll kind of just go through this. And you can kind of see here, this sculpture is like trying to deal with a lot of these like elements. Trying to deal with a lot of these like elements that are kind of formal. This exhibition was at a place called the Ballroom Projects. And it's sort of like here comes the sort of like screen back again, the chicken wire, the wall. And it's sort of like a platform for the sort of display of different kinds of archival materials. The prints come back around. This flag, which is kind of like a tattered sort of Mexican flag. We were working in the space and we had all our stuff out, which is like lots of photographs and archival materials related to this sort of era of the like late 70s. And the people that run the space were like, "Oh, we have this old Mexican flag. Do you want it?" And it was just kind of like, "Oh, that's a weird thing to ask me." But I was like, "Okay, sure, why not?" And so they gave us that flag, and we sort of brought it into this sculpture. And it's sort of like this idea of projection and media. It's an old projection screen, but instead of the screen, it's this flag, and sort of thinking about identity and like how one can sort of try to occupy some identity when there's already something there. And so how do you deal with that, what's like there already and what you are, and trying to navigate that problem. And then again, the sweet potatoes or other kinds of sort of indicative like roots kind of emerge as having a kind of power. Of course, you know, like this whole hemisphere was like, I think I was reading People's Indigenous History of the United States, and you know, this like whole hemisphere, it was like 4 times as many people on this hemisphere than there was in like Europe and stuff, and they were like totally thriving on like a kind of diet of like corn, squash, and beans, and like really like it's producing civilization based on this like complete protein. I mean, there's like so much activity, you know, was happening, like just monstrous amounts of like thriving civilization. So just thinking about food and its relationship to like kind of indigenousness. And, you know, thinking too about the export of food, like how is it that an Andean like potato could make its way all the way to become the symbol of some kind of Irish famine? It's just like just trying to trace these things is like kind of ironic and strange, and thinking about the tomato and it's like how it was like, you know, originated in the hemisphere here, and then it becomes like the symbol of a kind of certain type of cuisine that's like halfway across the globe, you know. So just thinking through those kinds of things too. And again, thinking about the Vietnam War and the sort of the politics of the Vietnam War, which were like, there was a test that you had to take once you were drafted, and it told you where you would go, and your choices were like quite a few, but one of the main choices was the front line. And the McNamara is like 100,000 in that test. They like changed the test so that people like Mexican people and people of color would be more likely to go to the front of the line. So just thinking about this kind of big political, historical kind of things in relationship to some kind of exploration of kind of archival practices. And the microphone is like an important sort of thing. It's stand-in for the body, a kind of not plugged in, so a kind of voice that's not a voice, or the possibility of a voice. And then, of course, always writing and poetry are sort of important. We all read some more. Tell you about this. So, part of one of the projects that we worked on, or whatever the performances, included reading from a textbook on how to learn Spanish, so a Spanish language textbook, especially kind of geared towards like a tourist market, so teaching Spanish to people who are going to come to Mexico, potentially to like kind of hang out and, you know, do whatever. And so we were sort of trying to look at these books and look at them in a different way and try to see if we could see them as poetry. And so part of this one of the performances that we did was to read this thing like almost like a poetry reading, but reading only the words that were like in the English, I guess. So like thinking about found poetry and like language acquisition. So this poem is called Extra Words. Yesterday, day before yesterday, last week, last month, last year, yesterday afternoon, yesterday morning, last night, night before last, last Saturday, last Sunday, the weekend, during, afterward, tomorrow, day after tomorrow, in a month, in 2 months, in a year, in a week, next year, today, this week, this month, this year, while, meanwhile. So these would be words you would like want to know in Spanish, I guess, if you were in Mexico. So just like finding these things kind of funny and interesting, and also kind of like poetic, like verbs to remember, to hope, to wait for, to expect. I hope to speak. Do you hope? Does he sing? Does she hope? Sing, sing, sing. Dance, dance, dance. I speak. I sing. I dance. And these are paired with like different drawings that Anthony's making of kind of cartoon characters that he's trying to remember from memory, including like different Disney characters, which I found kind of funny juxtaposition. But this poem is called Related To. I vote the vote, I use the use, I sing the song, I progress the progress, I steal the robbery, I study the study, I kiss the kiss, I insult the insult, I weigh the weight, I hate the hatred, I refresh the refreshment, I triumph the triumph, I work the work, I file the file, letters, I brush the brush, I draw the drawing, I divorce the divorce, I fail the failure, I shout the shout, scream, I greet the greeting, I change the change, I walk the road, I hug the hug, I arrange the arrangement. So just like kind of trying to like think about ways of writing that might be sort of not quite creative in a way. These works are from this piece that's called Not Peaceable and Quiet, which is like a performance that was presented at the Mountain Standard Time Festival in Calgary. And in this work, we're looking at trying to do some analysis of the role that sound plays in the structure of power, the construction of power. So thinking about like how sound is used as a policing mechanism, as a criminalizing mechanism, and how sound is used to legitimize certain kinds of cultures and sort of delegitimize others, and how it relates to expressions of power. And in it, there's like different elements of kind of performative actions, but also text. And then one of the texts was about this movie, Fitzcarraldo. I don't know if does anybody like Werner Herzog? You probably shouldn't. But anyways, he made this kind of a bunch of stuff, including this movie about a kind of like vagabond sort of character who's like in the Amazon, and he's sort of like languishing around. Of course, he's like German, and it's like the early kind of colonial rubber wars are about to sort of take place. And you know, like rubber was like kind of like, it's like a thing that comes from a tree, right? And it's like you need like plantations, and you need like all these slaves in these horrible conditions to produce all the rubber that was needed for like an automobile, for example, of course. And like Ford had like a sort of utopic city right down there that he was trying to use to produce all this rubber. Okay, so anyways, in a film set along the Amazon River during the violent colonial rule of the early 1900s, a European music aficionado living a charmingly impoverished lifestyle longs to bring the Italian opera star Enrico Caruso to the Peruvian city of Iquitos. In a documentary about the film's making, the director describes the main character as a dreamer who dreams of great operas in the jungle. He also describes the jungle as a place of obscenity and misery, where the birds don't really sing, they just screech in pain. For the director, the jungle conjures images of asphyxiation and choking, both words related to breath, air, voice, and death. There are many kinds of death: physical, social, ethical, sonic. The contrast between the sound of the jungle and the sound of opera is the perfect colonial dichotomy. The Amazon, characterized as a zone of sonic chaos and misery, is defined against the solemnity of opera, which signals civilization through its excess of air, organization, space, and life. The imperial ear hears the colonial territory as hostile, as an insurgent sounding out a rebellion against the aural superiority of Western authority. Unable to secure financing for this sonic fantasy of Enrico Caruso coming to Iquitos, the dreamer of operas decides to become a rubber tycoon. Rubber production in the Amazon, of course, brought a violent intensification of European colonization, necropolitical devastation, and inflicted apocalyptic transformations to indigenous societies. So under what other circumstances would a world-famous Italian tenor visit the jungle, except on a great wave of colonial resource extraction? As the steamship of the opera dreamer, so the opera dreamer, this character, buys a steamship because you need a steamship to transport rubber. As the steamship of the opera dreamer and rubber tycoon goes up the Pachatea River, a tributary of the Amazon, everything goes quiet. The crew, the boat, moving at half speed, and the jungle itself all go quiet. The captain whispers, "There are silences and there are silences. This is the kind I don't like." In order to ward off the Jivaros people who are known to attack colonial steamships, a gramophone is placed on the top deck, and Enrico Caruso is boomed into the jungle. The cook, who is indigenous himself, says, "Those bare asses have never heard music like that. That'll teach them to respect us." A sonic fantasy is enacted whereby a so-called civilized sound is broadcast in the hopes of disciplining the illiterate savage masses who wait on the edge of the jungle and mistake the sound of opera for the voice of a white god imparting the sacred word. So the performance includes different actions, different sonic kind of actions, and includes also readings of different texts and poems. Part of the text, not that text I just read, but part of that performance was a text about an exhibition and also about the Field Museum of Chicago, which you have your own version of it here, or we have our version of yours, or whatever, however that works, or every kind of place has a version of this thing of a field museum or a natural history museum, which has a specific kind of history that comes out of the emergence of anthropology as a discipline, archaeology, ethnology, and all those other insidious ologies that are attached to that, including like kind of physiognomic analysis of people, and then sort of tying intelligence to sort of features and so forth. So not too long ago, I wrote this article called Removal on Display about the Field Museum and their new program to sort of try to redress or readdress the sort of display practices that they've been engaged in for like so many years. One of the main things that they were trying to redress is this thing called the Hall of Native North Americans. And it's like a long hallway, and it's like displaying all these different artifacts, cultural objects, and so forth related to indigenous sort of North American societies. It was installed in the 1950s and hasn't been touched since then. So these display cases are kind of like a time traveling device. If you go in there, you immediately see kind of 1950s idea about what indigenous culture was about and how it should be presented to the world, kind of like as a contextless artifact of sort of curiosity. So this article tries to sort of deal with a lot of that stuff. And so this is one little paragraph. So it is also worth noting that many U.S. natural history museums have large collections of human remains, which are disproportionately Native American or non-European. Archaeology, which includes the material practice of removing artifacts from designated sites, was one of the driving forces behind this kind of collection of human remains. So the question of why Native American remains were understood to be collectible is directly related to European conceptualizations of who does and who does not count as fully human, who is part of history and who is categorized as prehistoric. Savage, barbaric, and civilized, far from loose descriptions, were official categories that late 19th century anthropologists, ethnologists, and social theorists used to create an evolutionary model of social development. So prominent 19th century writers and thinkers promoted the idea that all cultures pass through these three universal stages, which of course cast European styles of life as the most developed and desirable. Unsurprisingly, non-European, including people indigenous to native to North America, were mostly seen as lacking, stuck in the past, underdeveloped, or about to disappear. In 2002, there's a journal that the Field Museum puts out called Fieldiana, an academic journal published by the Field Museum. The late 19th century is described as a time when there was a feeling among American anthropologists that the aboriginal cultures of the New World should be studied immediately before the native way of life vanished forever. The use of the neutral term vanish stands out. Native lifeways did not simply disappear by accident, but were systematically destroyed as a focused project of public policy and populist politics through means including outright war and the deployment of well-armed vigilante and volunteer militias that were subsidized by federal and state governments. So I don't know, it's just like trying to think through these problems of like, how do we, on the one hand, sort of have a fury or like a kind of fever of like collecting what's disappearing at the same time that we're producing that production of disappearance, I guess, was one of the main things that this article was trying to get at. And it also covered an exhibition that was installed, which was an exhibition by an artist named Chris Papan, who installed a video installation projected high above the artifacts on display. And it was large enough to be seen, from distances to the atrium. So Papan collaborated with a bunch of photojournalists and also Native North American archivists and musicians to produce this video soundtrack and video that looped throughout the hall. It was it's kind of like electronic music, but indigenous electronic music. And it was intermingled with this audio captured during a 1983 powwow in Macy, Nebraska. And there's a bunch of more stuff on it here, but those are some things I thought might be worth kind of sort of sharing. And then maybe one thing, since I don't know if there's like a minute or two, but I can show maybe this, let's see, some video that's going to be at DiverseWorks, maybe.
But I mean, you're talking about the insensitivity of public institutions, in this case the universities that you're mentioning here. You're talking about the necessity to put pressure on in terms of the existing channels of communication. Now, when those channels of communications fail, as they have failed evidently at other places, one reason why this has happened, then it becomes necessary to protest. That everything has been, historically speaking, a question of practice. We have been long on practice, very short on theory, but it's very short on ideological development. because you still come to the reality or the realization that the political system is controlled by a definite economic ruling class apparatus in society. There is such a thing as American imperialism, regardless of whether one is a Marxist or not. It was really a case of pronouncements or statements as opposed to the development of well-defined, concretely laid out political programs. They're studying Marxist theory, they're studying other kinds of things, although very definitely they're not a Marxist group, this is why I don't put them on there. And I myself, as I will say shortly, do not see any dichotomy in a position of a nationalist and international position and a socialist revolution position. And I will get to that because I feel that without a nationalist base of operations or political action, you cannot get to the next step, which is, the class base and the socialist alternative, so to speak. Socialism or the socialist alternative worldwide it cannot be disputed that it is not a viable alternative. There's a very large number of people in the world who have chosen the socialist alternative, so you cannot dismiss that lightly anymore, especially given the defeat of American imperialism in Vietnam. There is a definite potential in this society here for a class struggle to unfold, for a socialist revolution to take place. The values of society of racism and capitalism and profit and competition and all that are being questioned even by the more conservative elements of society, Police Chief Davis not too long ago made the public remark that the police department now is organizing itself and trying to develop tactics to deal with what? Food riots. They began to realize, like other workers, that the political system is not to be divorced from the economic system, and that their condition, their situation as workers compel them to become more political, become more aggressive in the sense of developing a political alternative in society.
So that's like one of 4 videos that's going to be installed at DiverseWorks, along with a bunch of other things that is like kind of like a mixtape or a video mixtape, trying to deal with like experimental sound, contextualizing footage. The footage was from the Chicano moratorium that I mentioned earlier, the protests against the Vietnam War. That turned into a riot, or really was turned into a riot by kind of violent police engagement. So and I thought maybe one other thing you might want to see, if you could stand one more thing, is this is the footage from the student-produced rock opera, the kind of rehearsal footage paired with some different things. And well, I'll just kind of bypass it and get to the part that I think is really good. You can kind of see them here, kind of like practicing, rehearsing, singing their David Bowie, their Chicano version of David Bowie. And then this video is part of that installation at Bemis and so forth. But one of the things that I really kind of like about it is this part. And this part was like produced with David Bowie, or with Greg Barrios' input. He sent me like a draft of this. I digitized this video, this 8mm footage, and sent it to him. And then he took it and he sent me another version of it with like David Bowie's like music on top of it. And I thought that was really compelling. So I asked him if we could use that in the kind of show, and then he said yes. And so I did it. I redid his thing. I made it a little bit kind of more exhibition ready or whatever, but sort of like taking cues from his own interests and his desire to like kind of re-imbue the footage, because to him the footage was just like flat. It didn't tell the story of the students' play. It didn't do enough to like kind of conjure the feelings or emotions that were, you know, kind of emerging at the time. So adding the sound, and then he had done these really interesting kind of color corrections with whatever technology he's using, whatever software, and I kind of really peaked the colors up. So we took that idea and kind of we took that as an inspiration for some kind of a new approach to the footage. So this is kind of like maybe the ending piece.
Market square, so many mothers sighing. News had just come over. We had 5 years left crying. News guy wept and told us Earth was really dying. Cried so much his face was wet. Then I knew he was not lying. I heard telephones, opera house, favorite melodies. I saw boys, toys, electric irons and TVs. My brain hurt like a warehouse. It had no room to spare. I had to cram so many things to store everything in there. And all the fat, skinny people, and all the tall, short people, and all the nobody people, and all the somebody people. I never thought I'd need so many people. Girl my age went off ahead, hit some tiny children. If the black hadn't have pulled her off, I think she would have killed them. A soldier with a broken arm fixed the stair to the wheels of a Cadillac. Cop knelt and kissed the feet of a priest, and the queer threw up the sight of that. I think I saw you in an ice cream parlor, drinking milkshakes cold and long, smiling and waving and looking so fine. Don't think you knew you were in the song. And it was cold and it rained, so I felt like an actor, and I thought of more, and I wanted to get back there. Your face, your race, the way that you talk, I kiss you, you're beautiful, I want you to walk. We got 5 years stuck on my 5
So I think in like some activity like this and the kind of the collage work with the costumes and thinking through the archive of the musical performers and creating experimental music in relationship to this play, it's like all a way to try and kind of find some way to enliven a sort of artifact that is like out of its time or out of its place or partial, and try to make something kind of that simulates completion but without worrying about something being whole at the same time. So that's kind of like some of the things that we've been working on for the last 3 or 4 years or so. I think that's like an hour. Did I do my thing? Yes, all right, thanks.
I was just curious if you could talk a little bit about something you mentioned early on. Were you recently asked to be a part of a project that responds to like the political crisis in Venezuela, or like a call for American artists to oppose?
That's the exhibition Artist Call Against U.S. Intervention in Central America. Is that what you're talking about? Yeah, so that it's a kind of historical thing. So it's like a curator now, contemporary curator, is looking at the history of these exhibitions that happened in the 80s that were kind of focused in New York, but other places, where there were a series of exhibitions that was called Artist Call, and that's in short. And all the exhibitions were like kind of geared towards bringing attention to U.S. intervention in Latin America, but specifically Central America. And so there's like a historical lens that's now being applied to that era. So there's a restaging of like many of those works, and also a commissioning of new works by some of the artists that participated in those original exhibitions. And so the catalog that's being produced has like several different essays. And so I'm writing one essay about the United Fruit Company and the Chiquita banana and the importation of the banana and the sort of banana republic as a kind of sort of like colonialist thing, but also like the Banana Republic as in the outfit clothing place too, and the sort of fantasy that Banana Republic outfit, how that summons this kind of colonial fantasy of exploration, kind of like exotic being abroad into some kind of like rough terrain of some place far away always, and so looking at that, and also at some Busby Berkeley film that has like a big scene of all these of this banana plantation scene in it. So that's what that's about. Yeah, sure.
Thank you. I thought that was really just amazing and inspiring, particularly in comparison or contrast with the lecture we heard last week, which is by an art historian who's doing research on Minjung art, which is this Korean art practice or movement in the 1980s that came about during a time of political upheaval and resistance. And just her research methodologies and what she as a scholarly art historian does with her research versus your research methods and what you do with your research. It's just interesting to see. What you do is pretty inspiring to me. So, but here's my question.
Okay.
It's really about the projects in which you present a lot of material in, well, all of your art practices, really. But it came up when you were showing some of the work that involved archival materials shown in vitrines.
Okay.
And it raised for me this question, and it also comes up for the performance and just all your work, and it comes up for a lot of us as artists. It's about your expectations and hopes for your audience, and how you hope that people will engage with your work, and what you feel your responsibility is to them, or what you're offering to them, and what kind of experience might happen. Just, I guess it has to do with that conjunction of like people your role, people who see your work, your responsibility, your hopes for their reception, what you want to catalyze or generate through that kind of what you described as a formal thickening.
Yeah. I want kind of like, maybe to the detriment, kind of wordy. And I always like want to produce some context to help people kind of gain access. I can't dictate that they read it or pay attention or care. So it's hard to me to like insist. But I will provide the opportunity, as if somebody wants to like know more about everything, to have a points of kind of place to explore, or points where they can kind of gain further contextual kind of information about something if it seems sort of like abstract or uncertain what one is confronting. So for example, this text was produced in relationship to the sort of vitrines, and it kind of walks through like a lot of the materials, the sort of thinking. It's like an essay, but it's like an uncommissioned essay, so I just wrote it because I wanted to. And to like do some descriptive work, but also some theoretical and conceptual work around the vitrine, and also the objects and display and what I thought they might be about, but I don't know 1,000% because it's sort of like fictional, sort of imaginary production in a way. Yeah, so I think that's kind of how I'd answer that was for the vitrines. Is I was kind of produced this text that was like a free publication that you could take. Like again, I don't know. It's hard to know what people will read or how much they want to read or what not, but I feel like it's at least my responsibility to offer a potential for further engagement and further sort of like contextual sort of frameworks to exist. Is that?
Yeah, totally. I felt like this lecture was a really great format for me to engage with your work because you were, captured my attention and could pull, synthesize things from all, kinds of different places. And I was just completely enthralled, to be honest.
Thank you.
I wonder, when you teach a lot, right? So does your teaching work like this too at all?
Not exactly. I don't know if we want to get into the mechanics of teaching up here, but it's like there's a lot more sort of stuff that I'm not in control of, and that I'm serving in a way. So it's a little bit different in that sense. But I do think of critical pedagogy as being important to the practice, and critical pedagogy is a way of like teaching that hopefully engages analysis of the power dynamics that are in place, and a sort of institutional critique of like who gets to decide what knowledge is, under what conditions, and what those decisions about knowledge production, what do they support, what do they kind of critique, do they critique, and sort of coming from like Pablo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, and also the theater of the oppressed, and thinking about teaching as more than a beaming of information from some expert's head into some novice's head, but as a kind of critical engagement with ideas. Hopefully, that's the best possible scenario.
So that was super cool.
It doesn't even...
Oh, recording, okay.
It's like the talking stick. You hold it and you're the one who's speaking.
I'll try to speak up then.
Yeah.
That was really, really cool. I had a question about, I got the impression that most of your archival practice is just kind of based on real material. So I was curious about those moments where you kind of insert a fiction in there, because I only saw maybe one, which was that, exactly.
Oh, yeah.
And then there was the little awesome insertion of like Richard Serra's refried beans. But I was wondering if this is something that you do a lot, and whether there's any level of, a sort of worry about whether the audience would start to doubt other parts of the project.
Yeah, sure. This thing is like kind of peppered with things that are like, I'm just putting them together and sort of like reproducing them and sort of saying that they all belong together, just because I say so in a way. Like, but the question I think is about like doubting or truth or something like that. And, of course, we have this kind of post-truth moment, so everybody's kind of thinking a lot about like, what are the legacies of all these like kind of so-called postmodern practices of destabilizing truth, and now we're stuck with this kind of like anything can be true at any moment. So I don't know, I kind of look at I.O. Wiseman's work a lot. He's like the forensic architect theorist. And his idea is like, truth, it's not like that it's universal or relative, because on the one hand, it's not like a universal thing that is like unassailable, and it's not a relative thing in the sense that anything can be true at any moment, so there's like no truth. but it's like a common project that we sort of all build together. And so that, and if you're building something in a kind of field of political engagement, like the truth, if you're building it in the world, it's also interacting with the sort of networks of power. So in a way, it's sort of like the truth tells more than the truth. It tells also about like the sort of beliefs or sort of kinds of, I guess, it tells you a lot about the sort of beliefs and intentions about the people constructing truths, if you will. So to me, anyways, it's not that it's like doubtful or true or verifiable or fact or if not a fact, but more like about a kind of common thing that's being constructed and a sort of kind of across a group of people. And that construction in a way is like about the sort of beliefs and the kinds of like, I guess, commitments, maybe political commitments that we might have. I don't know if that's like some roundabout way of trying to deal with this problem of truth or post-truth or relativism or universality, because we know universal truth has been used as a colonial imperialist tool, right? This is the universal figure. It looks like this. Anything that departs from that is an aberration, is not quite enough, it's partial. So the idea of universal truth is like, or some kind of truth like that is, it's like a political sort of tool in a way, a kind of tool of sort of capitalism too, I suppose. And then, so that can't stand, you know, that idea of like a kind of truth with a capital T, but also at the same time we are kind of weary in this moment of like post-truth, right? Of anything being true, just say it, deny it, it doesn't matter. You know? So that's why I think that both of those terms, I don't think either one of those things actually really confronts, you know, the problem. They're both, there's just like, it's like this thing where you divide things into binaries and then all of a sudden they're just about those two things, and that decision you made initially to divide them into two things now constructs everything that comes afterwards, you know? So maybe the idea of like, you know, whether it's fiction or truth or whatever, those two things are not, I don't know, maybe those aren't the right kinds of terms, and just sort of thinking about it like as a kind of reactivation or reanimation of something, of an artifact of some kind through some kind of critical creative engagement. I don't know. That's what I would say, I guess.
Yeah, that was a very complete answer.
Okay, sorry.
My question was very minor. It was more like,
Yeah.
do you ever have moments of people walking into a gallery or space being like, oh, is that real? And like, does that matter at all?
Greg came to the show with his friends and some of the students that were in the play. I wasn't there when he came in, but he wrote me and told me that they were just thrilled. And they knew that I added the David Bowie and that I did all the effects, but that didn't matter because what was more important was that it engaged their truth, I guess, in some kind of way, whatever that was, even if it's an illusion or a production. Does that make sense? Yeah, yeah.
Maybe this like kind of builds off of the previous question, but I was wondering about your feelings towards balancing sort of this direct exposition of your research and the aesthetics and the aesthetic quality of that. It kind of came up when you showed us some of the videos later, the archival speech footage with sort of this ambient sound. I was going to ask directly what the source of that sound was, but kind of like that balance of creating something that is both sonically appealing or visually appealing with something that is loaded with information and your research.
Yeah, so the text or the voice was like a kind of edited version of a presentation that this kind of mid-'80s Chicano studies professor gave about like nationalism versus like identity politics versus Marxism, you know, trying to like negotiate some of these problems, like how do we kind of identify in this way at the same time that we have, how do we like meld like identity politics and like Marxism, which is kind of an interesting problem and one that like a lot of people know about today, but it was actually something that was being engaged like long ago already by like brown thinkers who were like Fanon, et cetera, who are trying to navigate these same problems. And the music itself, actually, I'm kind of like interested in being an experimental musician, just as a thing that I like want to do. And I always have been, and so I'm always like making music, learning things about music, trying to collaborate with different people. So the audio is me and my friend Matt and Anthony, and also this other performer, Madam Data, kind of produce. And I just took all the pieces and mixed it together to make whatever I want out of it. So I'm always kind of enacting my own desire in a way. But it's not like desire to just self-satisfy. It's like desire to see something in the world that doesn't exist, I guess, and like letting that desire, like carrying it and letting it kind of resonate with me until the point where something actually thickens or some material is produced out of it.
Hi, that was a really interesting speech. I really enjoyed it. My question is sort of about going back to the archive and your concept of archive. I know you get a lot of information through the archive. I was just wondering what's your personal role in this archive? Because archive for me is such an intense thing tied to the history and society and community and culture, while personal one can't tie to this community or society, but somehow there are still differences. I wonder how you assure yourself personally through this archive and produce archive from the past and in the future, maybe?
Well, I mean, the first thing you do is like read something, Archive Fever or whatever, and you start to get the sense that like, okay, there's an idea that the archive tells you something, but that's not really how it works. It's like you look at something and construct a narrative in relationship to this object. It's not conveying the information. You're constructing it simultaneously through some kind of dialogic exchange with something that's not even from this time. It's from a different time. It's like out of its time, you know? So it's kind of like transported already to you. And so now you're coming at this thing that has crossed time, and you're intersecting that horizon of time, but only partially through this sort of remnant of some kind with your present horizon of time. And so you have this like kind of engagement of temporalities happening immediately. So to me, that's like very compelling because it tells something about how history is constructed and if it's constructed, then it's constructed from what? A point of view. And if you're standing in a place and you're constructing history from a position, that means you have an interested, vested position. And so it means something it's not neutral or objective or anything like that. It's like something that is purposely constructed from a position. And if you're in a position, you're in a political position, socio-political network, right? So to me, that's my engagement with it. It's like thinking about taking a different position to engage something like that is supposedly tells you what it is in advance, like evidentiary. And trying to construct some kind of counter story to the story and trying to engage like the politics of counter histories, things like that. Yep. I wonder if any of this makes sense. I feel like a being John Malkovich moment. Anything else? Okay, I think I got the thumbs up. All right, thanks so much. I appreciate it.